Welcome back, and we're doing the power rankings now for the 90s. Notice there's 27 numbers on the board because there were 27 teams at the end of the decade, meaning that the 27th team didn't really have a chance to get any points under the system that I have, but they played. So watch for tomorrow's video to have next week's video to have 21 teams. Also, while people are still arguing over why I have certain favorites and don't, that's my favorite thing right now. That might be the thing that gets me out of bed to do these videos every day, is I can't wait to talk about my favorites and have people tell me why I'm wrong. That's what I'm waiting for. That's gonna be great. So while that's going on, we'll look at the top 27 power rankings. I use the exact same points system that I used last time. Now I've had people say, well, why don't you tell us your point system? Because then people are going to tell me it's stupid. People are going to tell me, nope, do this. And then I'm going to get graphs sent to me in the email. I'm going to have if you go over, there's this site has this data. And no, I'm not doing that. Because again, I've tried in the past where I've been like, hey, I'm using this system. People are like, no, that's dumb. Don't use that system. Okay. And then nobody can agree on the system. So at number 27 is Nashville, because that was their first year. And so I can't, or well, at the very least, they didn't have a chance. They just didn't have a chance to do much of anything. This was the year before the Atlanta Thrashers came in. So yeah, this is from 89-90 to 98-99. So the Thrashers came in the year after, and then Columbus and Minnesota came in after that. So that's why you're not seeing them. And if you're looking for Vegas, I don't know what to tell you. Welcome. I don't know what to tell you. Number 26. They hadn't had any success to this stage, and that's Tampa Bay. They had, I believe it's just the one. Yeah, just the one playoff appearance. And so it's hard to argue Tampa Bay any higher than 26th out of 27. But again, it's not the end of the world, because Tampa Bay in the 2000s, of course, did pretty well for themselves. Number 25. They had a decent second round appearance in there during the 90s, and that's the Anaheim Ducks, who were the Mighty Ducks of Anaheim at the time. Yeah, I'm still going to be using the current logos, even though a number of them have changed. And when we get into the 80s, and then there's only 21 teams, I can probably get more creative about which magnets I'm using, have some more fun with it that way. I'm wearing a current Montreal Canadiens jersey just because, but I'll try to, when I'm doing the 80s one, wear a more current jersey. So yeah, we're up to 25. Number 24, this includes Hartford, Carolina Hurricanes. No success at all as Hartford Whalers, and very little as Carolina either. And of course, they would have more success in subsequent decades than they had in this one. The Hartford Whalers, it was a long, tough slog for the Hartford Whalers. Number 23. I keep looking over like I'm going to see last week's numbers. Like I'm still in the week by week where I'm used to doing the last week, moving up to, I'm not doing that with the decades. The Islanders. Now, when I do the 80s next week, spoiler alert, I have a funny feeling that with my system, the Islanders will be number 1 or number 2. It'll either be the Islanders or Edmonton. It has to be. I'm leaning towards it probably is going to end up being Edmonton, just because the Islanders faded during the decade and the Oilers didn't. The Oilers kept getting better. So the Islanders had a rough 90s. They did have the run in 93, which was kind of inspired. They knocked off the Pittsburgh Penguins in 93 and cost them the chance for three straight Stanley Cups. Today, I did the video on the 93 series between Toronto and LA, and honestly, it was either that or Pittsburgh and the Islanders. And it was close. But to me, the biggest talking point, of course, was the controversy with Toronto and LA, so I went with that series. Number 22. And here's the thing. Ottawa, to start the decade, they're not there. So in 90, they're not there. And their expansion team was absolutely awful. Just terrible first year. But while the first 3 or 4 years were bad, by the end of the decade, they were a pretty darn good team. So if you're a current Ottawa Senators fan saying, well, I guess things could be worse, they were. And the team still found its way and turned itself around. So by the end of the 90s, they were actually a pretty decent team, getting a lot of points. And when you accumulate that many top picks, and Use them on guys like Dag. You know, like that's the thing. They even had misses in their top picks, and yet still, here they were by the end of the decade, not being 27th out of 27 teams. Number 21, a couple of decent runs for the San Jose Sharks. The Sharks were a better expansion team than expected. They were expected to be just abysmal, and it was can they beat the 8 wins record of the Washington Capitals? And they did. They absolutely did. Their second year was abysmal, but then they made the playoffs. They knocked off Detroit. And I still remember, like, when they knocked off Detroit, I felt great. That was one of my favorite moments in the 90s, was when the Detroit Red Wings looked like they were going to be this machine that went to a Stanley Cup, and the Sharks, of all teams, knocked them off in the first round. Number 20, I believe that was first round. Was it second? Anyways, number 20, based almost entirely on that run to the Stanley Cup final, the Florida Panthers ended up being 20th out of 27 teams on this board. They made it to the Stanley Cup finals. They made it to round 1 the year after. And that's it. That's where the happiness ends if you're a Florida fan. And so 20th is as high as they get. And again, most of those points are going to come from being a Stanley Cup finalist. Number 19, including the Winnipeg Jets, and that's the Arizona Coyotes. So before they went to Arizona, the Jets had a pretty miserable early mid-90s. And then after going to Arizona, it was a pretty overall miserable run as well. Getting out of the first round was a challenge, and for them, whether in Winnipeg or Arizona, it was just mediocrity all around. And yeah, so we're into 2 decades ago, and it's still kind of, well, Arizona's down near the bottom. I apologize to Coyotes fans everywhere. It's too bad. Number 18, rough decade for the Calgary Flames. The Calgary Flames in 89 are your Stanley Cup champions. And it looked like they could win multiple Stanley Cups with the team they'd put together. But instead of that, we get a team in the Flames that just, they weren't very good. And by the mid-90s, they were kind of a disaster. So things fell apart kind of quickly for the Calgary Flames, and that's how you end up 18th. They did not defend their Stanley Cup championship. They didn't get back to the Stanley Cup finals until 2004. Number 17, Philadelphia. Philadelphia had a rough start to the decade, and they, of course, made the Lindros trade. They were one of 2 teams that made the Lindros trade. But that's a whole other topic for a whole other video. Yeah, Lindros was traded twice at the same time. A pretty smart move there, and that's why when I talk about GMs for the Nordiques, I don't give a whole lot of praise to the Nordiques GM at the time because he traded him twice. But Philadelphia makes that trade, and they do get to a Stanley Cup Finals with Lindros, and by the end of the decade, they look like a team that should be able to win a Stanley Cup with Lindros in the lineup. The Legion of Doom line, of course, which was one of the most intimidating lines in the league at the time. And for the Flyers, it looks like they're on their way up. Now, of course, in the 2000s, we would see things kind of fall apart for them. But in the late 90s, they were very good. Number 16. This team was good around the mid-90s, and that's the Toronto Maple Leafs. The Maple Leafs did not get to the Stanley Cup Final in 93. Of course, they were blocked from the Stanley Cup Final again in 94, this time by the Canucks. And those were probably the best Maple Leaf teams I've seen in my lifetime. Now, there were some good ones around the early 2000s as well, but the Leafs have been mired in this good, not great, for times where they've been a playoff team and where they've looked like kind of a contender or getting close to a contender. And there were times in the mid-90s where it looked like, yeah, no, they should be able to win one. There was certainly enough hype for it. It just never quite came together. Number 15, Los Angeles. So, the Kings, of course, 93, they make it to the Stanley Cup Finals, but there's not a whole lot of success outside of that. They had a couple of good regular seasons, and then, again, with the Kings and Gretzky, towards the mid-late 90s, things really fall apart kind of quickly. People will blame the Burger King jersey, the one that I wore in the LA video I was talking about, which I had this morning. But yeah, I don't really blame that. The LA-Toronto series, I mean. And yeah, for the Kings, it was a matter of, it seemed like their roster got old all at once. It's the only way I can describe it. It just felt like all these guys they brought in and they just all got old at once. Or they were putting together a team without thinking ahead. Either way. Number 14, Stanley Cup finalist in 94, the Vancouver Canucks. So they had a good run, early 90s. By the late 90s, they were atrocious. And they brought in Messier to try to prop things up with the idea of going on another run. They brought in Keenan as well with the idea of, hey, this guy's got a Stanley Cup, and we want a Stanley Cup, and it just didn't work. On no level did it work. And so for Vancouver Canuck fans, the late 90s kind of did away with the good feeling you had in the mid 90s, and so they end up kind of middle of the pack. Right at middle of the pack, basically. Number 13, also a middle of the pack team, who had their struggles along the way, and that's St. Louis. The St. Louis Blues, of course, in 2019 won their Stanley Cup. But their history before that Stanley Cup win, dotted with teams that were good in the regular season, couldn't get over the hump in the playoffs, which the early 90s Blues were another example of, and teams that were just middling. Good. Yeah, good team. Not fantastic, but good. So them being 13th on the board tells me that the system I have works pretty darn well. Because, yeah, they're just above the mid-mark, and they're not quite there. Now, they end up ahead of Vancouver, and LA were both finalists because St. Louis makes the playoffs more consistently. So over the decade, St. Louis had a better decade than Vancouver and LA. But they didn't have a Stanley Cup Finals run in there. Number 12, with the Stanley Cup Finals run in 98, the Washington Capitals end up 12th on the board. And they didn't quite get over the hump. The Detroit Red Wings smacked them down for having the nerve to be their Stanley Cup final opponents. And it was really kind of one-sided for the most part. There were a couple of games there that looked kind of close. I know I was really, really cheering for the Capitals that year, and it just didn't happen. And it was kind of heartbreaking, and then things devolved for the Capitals from there. And it was weird because that 98 team, they didn't look as good as some of the teams they had in the late 80s, but it worked. So, yeah, number 12, Washington Capitals. Number 11, I have a funny feeling that when we get to the 80s countdown, the Sabres will end up with a pretty decent overall ranking because the Buffalo Sabres have consistently been a good team over their history. If you look at their most recent decade, you're going to look at a team and say, this one just doesn't work. But every decade preceding that, they've been pretty darn good, going right back to the 70s. And so for Buffalo, they had the finals run in 99, which helps. And just overall a pretty solid, if unremarkable team with some goaltender named Hasek behind him. And so the Sabres end up being 11th. Number 10, the team that didn't keep Hasek, Chicago. The Chicago Blackhawks, of course, finalists in 92. The Chicago Blackhawks, who by the end of the 90s were kind of in disarray. But the early 90s Blackhawks were a pretty darn good team. And that was a team that I actually kind of sort of cheered for. And I know, it's hard to believe, right? But I kind of sort of did. And I found myself cheering for them against Edmonton, cheering for them against Pittsburgh, which ultimately may have been the reason why they didn't win a championship. So to Hawks fans everywhere, I apologize if I held them back until 2010 when I couldn't stand them and they finally won a Stanley Cup. So apologies if my hockey powers made that happen. But yeah, Chicago, pretty decent decade in the 90s, and they had at number 10. Number 9, our first Stanley Cup winner on the board is Edmonton. Edmonton, 90, they win the Stanley Cup, and then it's kind of an erosion from there. And by the end of the 90s, you have like a run to the second round here and there. I think they made 2 cuts into the second round. But in general, it's an also-ran team. I remember as a Dallas fan, when they were playing the Oilers, having the opinion of, all right, well, we got Edmonton in round 1, so we're going to round 2. Now, on one occasion, that didn't happen, but for the most part, it was like, all right, Dallas-Edmonton, this isn't really a feud because it's too one-sided to be a feud. And it was kind of nice as a Dallas fan to go, okay, well, we can beat Edmonton. Now, when we play Detroit, we get killed, but at least we'll beat Edmonton. That was kind of the attitude I had at the time. Number 8. They didn't win a Stanley Cup, but they had a consistently decent decade, and that's the Boston Bruins. They do get to a Stanley Cup final in 1990. They had some runs along the way and some excellent regular seasons as well. So because they had a stronger overall decade than the Stanley Cup champion of 1990 Oilers, they end up 1 spot ahead of them. But everybody after this, I'm pretty sure everybody after this is a Stanley Cup winner. So Boston's the highest rated team that didn't win a Stanley Cup. And yeah, that was something that I wore for quite a while, that this team just couldn't quite get there. They get to the conference finals in 91 and 92. And yeah. Now, by the end of the decade, they're a team that's into a rebuild. But early on, pretty solid run, and a couple of they had the finals and then the two conference finals. I'm trying to think. I think that was that. And then they end up drafting, of course, Joe Thornton, and they drafted Samsonov, and things get better after that. But early 90s were pretty good. Number 7, Montreal. The 1993 Stanley Cup champion Montreal Canadiens, and I'm wearing this because, hey, that's the last time a Canadian team won a Stanley Cup. Now, I'm not talking about a champion of teams or a championship team that have a bunch of Canadians, because St. Louis had a lot of Canadian content on their roster last year. But, it is a noteworthy point that was the last time Montreal won a Stanley Cup, and thus the last time a Canadian team won it. And it was kind of an inspirational run by Patrick Roy. So there's a lot there to look at and say, hey, that was a pretty solid team overall. And in overtime, they couldn't be beat. Or in overtime, Patrick Roy couldn't be beat. Number 6. Remember the 1990 or 1940 chants? I do. And most people watching this won't remember the 1940 chants. They got pretty loud. They got pretty darn loud by the time 94 rolled around. And then in 94, they went away. They went away because this team finally won a Stanley Cup. And they had some decent runs too. And not only that, but in 95, they had a decent shot at a repeat. It just didn't happen. And we would see the rise of a different power in their division, which would knock them off. Otherwise, maybe the Rangers do win multiple Stanley Cups. Mark Messier, of course, led this team to a Stanley Cup, led that team to a Stanley Cup, and attained God status among the legends of the NHL, because he did lead the New York Rangers back to the promised land 54 years after the last time that it had happened. So Messier, pretty darn solid reputation at that time in 94, and for the New York Rangers, it's a pretty decent decade. Number 5, including the Quebec Nordiques, and it's the Colorado Avalanche. So the Nordiques trade Lindros to the Flyers, and the pieces that they get back are a large part of what gets them a Stanley Cup as the Colorado Avalanche in year 1. And then from there, the Avalanche were a pretty consistent contender. And I always felt bad for Nordiques fans. Still do. For Nordiques fans that filled Le Colisée when that team was winning 12 games in a season. For the fans that kept rocking those jerseys despite awful, horrible seasons they had in the early 90s, I felt bad when the team got good and left town. And so, Colorado ends up being top 5. And again, that includes the Quebec Nordiques. There were points the Nordiques earned, which get Colorado up to the top 5. But that Stanley Cup definitely helps as well. So they would win the Stanley Cup, of course, in 96. They win it again in 2001. And it was a team that looked like it could win 4 or 5, to be honest. The Avalanche were pretty darn good, or Nordiques. Number 4, New Jersey. So the Devils have had a couple of pretty good decades. The 90s and the 2000s were both pretty darn solid for the New Jersey Devils. Now the 2010s, not as much. And when we get into the 80s, I don't expect New Jersey to finish very high. I don't. The New Jersey Devils in the 90s were just so well run. Coaching changes would happen regularly, but they always seemed to be at the right time. Trades got made. Free agents were allowed to walk. Things would happen with this team that you would look at and say, well, they're going to fall now. And then they didn't. Lou Lamoriello did a very good job of making this team competitive and then keeping that team competitive. So, the New Jersey Devils at number 4, pretty darn solid. So, again, we're with Stanley Cup champions. New Jersey won it in 95. 96 belonged to the Colorado Avalanche. 94, of course, to the Rangers. 93 to the Montreal Canadiens. 1990 to the Edmonton Oilers. 99 to end the decade went to Dallas, controversially so, but Dallas was pretty solid throughout the second half of that decade. Now, also included in that is Minnesota North Stars, the 91 Stanley Cup Finals run. So, whether Minnesota or as Dallas, this was a team that in the playoffs, other teams didn't want to see in the first round. Really didn't. And yet Dallas just couldn't get over the hump when it came to Detroit. Dallas, if they could have got past Detroit, they would have won multiple Stanley Cups. They would have been revered as one of the better teams of the last, I'll say, 50 years. But because they couldn't get past Detroit, Detroit is seen as that better team, and rightfully so. But for Dallas, good decade, and they're third. Number 2. Who's number 2? Right, Detroit, or Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh's number 2. I will talk about number 2, because when I was doing power rankings week by week, of course, people would argue I didn't talk much about number 2. I would just skip over it to go to 1, because everybody knows what number 1 is. But I'll talk about number 2, back-to-back Stanley Cups. Not only that, but in 91 and 92, neither team had a great overall season. And the great overall season, ironically, was 92-93, which was the year that they didn't get that third straight Stanley Cup championship. So it is interesting to note that Pittsburgh, when they became a really good regular season team, didn't get it done in the playoffs. When they looked okay going to the playoffs, not really a contender, they won it twice. And they were down 2-0 in 91 and a best of 7 against the Boston Bruins in the conference finals. And then they won 4 in a row. And then they steamrolled their way to a Stanley Cup. So Pittsburgh had an excellent overall decade. Again, by the end of that decade, it was starting to wane a little bit, but great start to the decade. Number 1, Detroit. And here's the interesting thing with the Detroit Red Wings. So they win multiple Stanley Cups. And if you're under the age of, I'll say, 30, you may not be aware that this was a team that was the joke franchise. The joke franchises really were the Rangers and the Wings. The Rangers hadn't won since 1940. The Wings hadn't won since 1955. And the Wings were home ice favorites, and they'd lose. And they lost regularly. Until they won that first Stanley Cup championship, they were basically the butt of almost every joke that hockey fans told that weren't Detroit fans. But once they won that first cup, all of that went away. And then it was not easier for them to win the second, but they knew what they had to do to win that second one, and they got it done. And then, of course, they won more Stanley Cups after that. So what they're remembered for is all these championships. So when people make fun of Tampa, or people make fun of Toronto, or people make fun of other franchises that haven't had a win in a while, remember, that narrative will continue until it's just gone. And for the Rangers in 94, it went away. And for the Red Wings in 97, it went away. So 97 and 98, they won it. 96, of course, was Colorado. And, yeah, there you go. So, power rankings for the 1990s. Detroit's the overall number 1. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for all your support during this time. And do stay safe, stay home, and wash your hands. I will talk to you again soon.